You are listening to Amphori's Unleash Opportunity webinar series, where we bring together thought leaders to explore the latest trends affecting open and sustainable trade.
Hello and welcome to the first in the series of Amphori's Unleash Opportunity webinar. Today we are going to talk about how to achieve sustainable business development with the Sustainable Development Goals. During this 1 hour webinar, we will explore how the SDGs set a framework for embedding and reporting on sustainable business growth. My name is Stephanie Leong. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at Amphori, and I will be moderating this webinar with our expert speakers. Before proceeding, I would like to share with you some logistics. The entire audience is on mute. If you do have any questions, please post them in the chat box located on the right-hand side of your screen. Please post your questions throughout the webinar, and we will do our best to answer them at the end. If we do not find the time to answer your question during the webinar, we will answer them offline and share in the follow-up email together with the webinar recording. Now, let me introduce you to the speakers and the agenda for the next hour. So first of all, we are pleased to welcome Caroline Rees, based in New York. Caroline is the founder and president of Shift Project, which is a leading center of expertise on the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights. Caroline may be familiar to some of those of you who attended our Unleash Opportunity conference in June in Amsterdam. She was our keynote speaker on the Sustainable Development Goals. So Caroline will introduce the SDGs as the international framework for companies. Then we will hear from James Gom. James is based in Geneva. He's a director of the Sustainable Development Goals at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is a CEO-led organization of more than 200 businesses working together to accelerate progress toward a sustainable world. He will showcase the SDG Hub as an example of a supportive tool for companies to monitor and report on their SDGs process. And last but not least, we have with us Frank Henke today, based in Germany, in Nuremberg. Frank is the Global Head of Environment and Sustainable Development at Adidas Group. As Amphori member, Adidas have been recognized as leaders in the field of sustainable development even long before we heard of the SDGs, and he will explain us how Adidas incorporate the SDGs as a framework within their company and business development. And then we will end this webinar today with a question and answer session with all our speakers. Well, first of all, I would like to tell you more about Amphori and our approach toward the Sustainable Development Goals. As many of you are aware, our association has undergone some really significant changes over the past year, including an update to our branding, Amphori, and most importantly to our vision. Amphori is the leading non-profit business association of global commerce that enables organizations to enhance human prosperity, use natural resources responsibly, and drive open trade globally. We represent over 2,300 retailers, importers, brands, and associations from more than 40 countries. And we have also on the ground support through 13 representatives across Europe and the rest of the world. So why did our association transform itself and create a new vision launched at the beginning of the year 2018? Because we know that the world is undergoing rapid changes, from political thinking, technological advancement, and new business frameworks, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, which bring new opportunities, challenges, and also solutions. So Vision 2030 was created as a framework for our organization to put forward a clear set of priorities to enable us and our members to be future fit. Our priority is to enable a world where all trade delivers social, environmental, and economic benefits for everyone. So it will not come as a surprise that for our first webinar of this series, we actually decided to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. Amphori has aligned its vision to support the SDGs. for Amfori, representing more than 2,000 members, the scale and dimension of the activities of our members through the world mean that we are in a unique position to positively impact the SDGs. So we have divided the SDGs into 3 categories, as you can see on this slide. Some are really core to our mission. Some we directly impact through our services to members. And for others, we believe that we indirectly impact them through the actions of our members. There are certain SDGs, such as SDG number 4, quality education, number 8, decent work and economic growth, and 17, partnership for goals, that are really core to what we do. During this webinar today, what we aim to is, on one hand, to share knowledge and best practices on what are the aim, scope of SDGs, what are the tools which exist and can really support companies with monitoring and reporting techniques. It's also the idea today to bring together different experts in the field who can share with you their knowledge and how they can support the implementation of the SDGs across your workplace. So enough from my side. I'm now going to hand the floor over to Caroline Rees, founder and president of Shift Project, who will give you some background on the Sustainable Development Goals as a global framework to guide sustainable business growth. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be with you all, sorry as we work our way through the tech side, but wonderful to be part of this conversation, and I apologize in advance for any repetition for those of you who indeed were at the conference that I had the privilege to attend earlier this year. But let me plunge right in talking a bit about the frameworks for this conversation and the position of human rights in this, which is the entry point for the conversation, I think much of it today. Really underlying that human rights are essentially the people part of what we're talking about in the context of sustainable development. Human rights, those issues that go to our basic dignity as human beings and our ability to live a life of dignity. And you can see the range of things we're talking about. Of course, that decent work element that comes through in right to freedom of association and just and favorable conditions at work, but also that right to education, access to water, freedom of expression and privacy as well, and many others besides. So it's little surprise that when it came to the Sustainable Development Goals, that the human rights were woven into them. But before the Sustainable Development Goals, already in 2011, the guiding principles had taken up the question of how human rights are relevant to companies. What is it that companies need to be thinking about as they go about their business with regard to their impacts on people? And it was the guiding principles that set this out, not just the responsibility of companies, also the duties of states. But for our purposes today, to talk a little bit more about that corporate responsibility to respect human rights. The guiding principles were telling us that companies need to embed a policy commitment to respect human rights across their operations and their value chains, really making it a part of how business gets done. That as they do that, human rights due diligence is a critical part of the equation, looking at assessing the risks to people, right? Risks to people as a vehicle to understanding some of the risks to business, but focusing on the risk to people first. Where are those risks? And then once we've identified those and assessed them, integrating that knowledge into decision making and taking actions on that, and then tracking what's working and communicating inside the company and outside, and all of this informed by engagement with stakeholders. So that's our ongoing human rights due diligence process that aims to prevent harm to people, to mitigate risks to people in connection with the business. But of course things can go wrong, and in these complex worlds and in the complex supply chains so many of you have, things will sometimes go wrong, and having the processes then also to enable access to remedy is critical. So that's what the guiding principles told us in 2011, and the governments and businesses have gone on to work with this framework and to build this into how business gets done. But then, as I said, in 2015, the SDGs come along, and interwoven into them again is the question of human rights. I was at the UN yesterday, where it was observed that it's estimated that 90% of the SDG targets, those 169 targets, 90% of them are founded in some way on human rights. So we have these two frameworks and we can see these connections to human rights, but what is the relationship then between the two of them? How are we to make sense of this as companies think about the SDGs and their contribution toward them? Well, perhaps one of the intriguing things that we have seen over the last couple of years is a risk of missing the opportunity in this connection. And it's strange in a way, because when it comes to the planetary part of sustainable development, right, the environmental and climate change issues embedded into the SDGs, companies have so long, I think, understood that in tackling the negative impacts connected with the business operations and the value chain lies a critical contribution to positive outcomes for sustainable development. So that for all companies is a part of an SDG strategy, how you tackle those negative impacts and drive positive change as a result. And of course, then the need and enthusiasm for those opportunities to have new investments, green products and innovations that can make that further critical contribution, but not forgetting where that core contribution lies. But the missed opportunity then comes when it comes to the people part of sustainable development. And the conversation so quickly can flip over to talking uniquely about where are these new positive contributions, innovations, the social products, the social investments, the strategic philanthropy and so forth, and can skip over this area of tackling negative impact, saying, well, yes, we know that needs to be done, but it's sort of compliance, isn't it? That's not where opportunity is. That's not where leadership lies. That's not where the innovation sits. And that we see again and again misses the reality of what respect for human rights is about. It's not just a do no harm proposition. It doesn't actually work if it's just seen as compliance. It is a clear and consistent opportunity for companies to contribute to the human dimension, the social part of sustainable development. And so, in fact, what we need to be looking at as we think about how respect for human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals come together, we need to be thinking about this in the same way as we think about the planetary contributions. Every company can make a critical contribution to this aspect of sustainable development by tackling impacts across its operations, the company's operations and its value chain. That in doing so, companies are not just doing no harm and not just reducing negatives. They can have transformative positive outcomes for people. And of course, I'm sorry, it's happened again. Oh, okay, let me hand you back. We're going to change back to yourselves. I'm handing back to you, and I'm going to keep talking. In the interests of time and other presenters, we need to be thinking about those positive outcomes in the same way for people, where the core contribution comes from tackling the negative impacts and driving positive change through that. And we've been really pleased to be able to collaborate with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and you'll be hearing from James in just a moment around this connection between respect for human rights and positive change and contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. Do click forward for me onto the next slide. And you'll see in the publication that we recently launched with the World Business Council, with some case studies around this image that helps us think about a holistic approach, a holistic strategy around the SDGs. On the one hand, looking at those risks to people and planet, understanding how they can be tackled in ways that make positive outcomes and positive contributions to the SDGs, while at the same time looking for where are those beneficial green and social products and services that in parallel can make further contributions, and how can those then be delivered and developed while minimizing the risks to people and planet along the way. So thinking in this combined and holistic way about both people and planet, both risks along the way and the positive contributions. And on to the next slide there, really embracing the transformative power of respect for human rights in practice. The next slide we'll go through quickly, and please just click through the animation so that it pulls all the images up. It's one example I like to use of the catalytic effect that efforts to address human rights risks, thank you, can bring to people and the SDGs, that underlying the absence of living wages, in work poverty, in other words, are a number of human rights: freedom of association, right to collective bargaining, non-discrimination. But that as companies push towards living wages in their operations and in their value chains, they unleash access to the right to food, reductions in child labour and the risks of child labour, children then accessing education, the right to health. People can reduce their working hours and enjoy the right to family life, improve their own health and well-being, and of course have greater access to adequate housing. And you see the connections to so many SDGs as a result of this. So let me briefly, just on the next slide, highlight this publication, The Human Rights Opportunity, and the case studies that it holds to show not just that in theory, as we think about respect for human rights, companies can make this contribution to the SDGs, but so convincingly in practice how we see it already happening in multiple ways. On the next slide, you will see, and again, please click through the animations, Malawi Tea 2020 is one example of this. Just pause there for me. Pulling together both the buyers in the tea chain in Malawi, the overseas buyers, and the domestic producers, and the local trade union and NGOs to work around living wages, connecting it with other dimensions, sustainable production as well, nutrition, and seeing how these issues are connected, particularly for the most impoverished women in those supply chains, and contributing in so doing to multiple SDGs. But then also at the level of SMEs in the textile supply chain, a Turkish manufacturer here, working directly with their own workers to say what constitutes a living wage for you, to understand that from their employees' perspective, and then engaging with their buyers to say this is the difference that it makes in price. Work with us to deliver this price so that we can ensure those wages get to our employees. Click on, if you would, through to the next slide, actually. Another example from those case studies, gender discrimination. This again looks at the supply chain for strawberries in Morocco, working particularly again understanding the vulnerability of women in those strawberry fields, and raising their voice, raising their awareness of their own rights and their ability to talk about what they need to improve their lives from a rights-based perspective, already showing tangible improvements against SDGs in relation to safer transport, improved social security, and their ability to understand and voice their own needs around their human rights. On the next slide, then, you'll see another example. This is land-related human rights, a draw example from PepsiCo here, working with Oxfam. So many of these are collaborations and innovations. Working in this case to look at the company community partnerships and the issues that affect communities and smallholders around land and the rights to livelihood and the rights to informed consent that sit around those issues. Tackling them in ways that are making already tangible contributions towards the SDGs you see listed here. And in my last example on forced labour, if you move to the next slide, again, I go back here to the SME arena. There is nothing unique to large companies around this. Here, Penguin Apparel in India has been directly saying, how do we eradicate forced labour from our own workplaces, understanding the risks that sit in the labour supply chain, and tackling that by making sure that we have insight into where our workers are coming from and the risks they faced in getting to our workplace. In so doing, again, contributing not just to SDG 8 on decent work and of course the forced labour target, but these other targets and the goals that sit above them as well. So in closing on my next slide, just to recap really the fact that we need to understand the respect for human rights agenda, what the UN guiding principles are telling companies about how to tackle, how to go about these risks to people that sit in their operations and value chains. We need to understand that as an integral part of any coherent SDG strategy, as not just an integral part, but as in many ways the single greatest opportunity for companies to contribute to the human dimension of sustainable development by harnessing this part of a company's work, by taking it out of the compliance box, by moving beyond a do no harm approach to this. We can really unleash transformative change in people's lives and make those critical changes we need to achieve the SDGs. Back to the Secretariat, and apologies for the technical challenges.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for this very inspiring presentation on how SDGs can really unleash business transformation. Before we continue, I would like to ask our listeners and remind them that if you have any questions, do not hesitate to post them on the chat box on the right side of your screen. And now we will move to James Gom, Director of SDGs at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. James will present some practical guidance on embedding, measuring, and reporting on the SDGs. James, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Happy Global Goals Day. 3 years to the day since the SDGs were launched, and lots of progress being made, including among the private sector, who is continuing to embrace this agenda and look for more innovative ways to integrate it into their strategic dimensions. I've got 10 minutes to take you through some practical steps on how to do that. It won't be an exhaustive guide, but hopefully a few ideas coming up about how to integrate this agenda more effectively. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Great, so just to quickly introduce who I am, for those of you not familiar with the WBCSD logo, this is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and you may not recognize this logo, but if you move to the next slide, you may recognize some of these logos. And these are the companies that sit behind our organization. We are a business membership organization of around 200 leading multinationals who are really pioneering in the sustainable business sphere. And we provide a forum for these companies to come together to discuss business solutions to sustainability issues. Collectively, we're able to bring companies together to solve those issues and challenges that they maybe can't face by themselves, and to work together towards realizing this vision of accelerating progress towards a world where sustainable business is more successful. So next slide, please. So before we get started, just to frame the discussion with how we at WBCSD see the SDGs, the first thing to note is that this is an agenda which really will not be achieved without the private sector's strong and continued involvement. The private sector has a critical role to play as an engine of employment and growth, a driver of technology and innovation, and of course a source of finance as well. So a critical role that has to be played by business if we are to achieve the goals by 2030. Next slide, please. But while the SDGs need business in order to be realized, there are also some very important implications of this agenda for business that all companies really should be aware of on the road to 2030. And we've boiled this down to 4 key elements: risks of inaction, capturing opportunities, governance and transparency, and the need for collaboration. So these are the 4 key things to understand when tackling the integration of the SDGs. And I'll just go into a little bit more detail on each of these. So next, please. So first of all, the risks of inaction. What risks do those companies that fail to engage meaningfully and strategically with this agenda face? So we have operational risk. In a world of mounting social and environmental burdens, unless there is a collaborative effort to tackle the SDGs, business face an operating environment which will soon become no longer viable. In the next 10 to 15 years, various environmental and social stresses will prevent growth as we would like it. Then we also face reputational risks and regulatory risks. Those companies that aren't engaging with this agenda, this is the new global landscape, the new global language of sustainability. Important to be able to speak that language. And this will also be translated as various governments around the world move to implement the SDGs into regulatory implications as well, which again, if you fail to think about them, pose risks to your business. Finally, market disruption. If your competitors are sourcing out innovative, new, inclusive, and sustainable business models, and you're not, you risk being left behind. Next, please. And of course, on the flip side, to the risk element, there's also the opportunity section. So the SDGs also represent a historic opportunity for business. And this translates into four key things we've highlighted here. New markets. So the Better Business, Better World report released by the Business and Sustainable Development Commission, which came out in 2017, highlights $12 trillion of market opportunities that can be unleashed by 2030 annually if the SDGs are achieved. On the flip side, there's also the SDGs provide a framework for helping you to enhance your risk management functions. It used to be in the sustainability field, it was often hard to know which issue was going to emerge next as the key issue that you should be focusing. We now have a framework of the issues that are going to be paramount over the next 15 years or so. So we know what risks are coming and we can take action appropriately. The SDGs can also help us to build up trust in business at a time when trust in all institutions is under threat. And finally, the SDGs also increasingly a benefit in terms of access to capital. We saw in 2018 already 3 organizations highlighted here have secured ESG-linked facilities from groups of different financial institutions. So we're seeing ESG performance being directly linked to cost of capital for these organizations, which is really a revolutionary development and something that we see only increasing in the next years. Next, please. And then I won't go into too much detail here, but also the governance and transparency implications of the SDGs. You may be familiar with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and this really marks the beginning of a new era, I think, in terms of disclosure, in terms of investors looking for more details on ESG areas and how those are being integrated into corporate strategy. There's also increasingly more detailed analysis and guidance on how business should be reporting on the SDGs. Efforts by GRI and the UN Global Compact on their business reporting on the SDGs work, really setting out standards now for how companies should be reporting on this agenda. And then finally, we're also seeing a lot more mounting scrutiny of business reporting on the SDGs. Launched yesterday here in New York, where I am this week, was the World Benchmarking Alliance. And this is an initiative that will look over the next 5 to 10 years or so to produce a benchmarking of the 2,000 of the world's largest companies in terms of their SDG performance. So more scrutiny on business in this regard. Next, please. And then finally, key to the SDGs is collaboration. The lofty and transformative ambitions of the goals really won't be achieved by business as usual. And they call for new forms of collaboration. That's collaboration at SDG target level. We're already starting to see new initiatives emerge there. Collaboration at the sector level. And I've highlighted here a piece of work that WBCSD has led with the chemical sector companies from within its membership to produce an SDG roadmap for that sector of how it should develop on the road to 2030 and how it can maximize its contribution to the goals. And then also collaboration at the systemic level, so different sectors coming together to tackle transformation of entire economic systems. And we see this with the Food and Land Use Coalition that's emerged over the last few years as well. Next, please. So that's really just a bit of background on how we see the SDGs and the benefits and the implications of why we should integrate them into our strategic thinking. But in terms of how to do that, possibly one of the most easily accessible guidelines on how to do that is the SDG Compass. And we developed this in collaboration with the UN Global Compact and GRI, launched back in 2015 as the goals were coming out. And this really sets out a simple 5-step framework for thinking about how to align and integrate and interact with the SDGs. Next slide, please. And here we have those 5 key steps laid out. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just the general framework is step 1, understanding the SDGs and what they mean for business. Step 2, defining priorities, so looking where you have the capacity to have the most impact and where you should be focusing your efforts on this very broad agenda. Setting goals, so how can you actually turn ambition into actual targets? Integrating those goals and the general philosophy behind the SDGs into your business operations, and then finally reporting and communicating on your progress. Next slide, please. So I won't go into details on every single step, but I'm just going to highlight a few key considerations to bear in mind as you go through those various steps. So the first is to make sure that when you're making efforts to understand the SDGs, explore the SDGs at target level. We're seeing, I think, too much superficial engagement with the goals. To really understand the SDGs, you need to have that granularity of what the SDG targets represent. A good case in point is SDG 3 around health. If you just took the goal around health, that's not as deep enough as understanding the targets underneath. So 3.6 is around reducing road traffic accidents, for example. So you may think that as a mining company or an energy company, for example, you have no real link to SDG 3 on health, but the road traffic accident thing is something that's certainly material to your organization. Next slide, please. The next is to try and understand as much as possible how business can contribute to the SDGs, and there's a wealth of literature that's out there on this. The UN Global Compact's Blueprint for Business Leadership and the SDG Industry Matrix give some good examples of how business can drive impact on the SDGs through new business opportunities and markets popping up. And then also crucial is that understanding, as Caroline was highlighting, the human rights opportunity that's there as well, and framing that capacity for companies to enhance their human rights due diligence and their human rights interactions, that really being a key way to contribute to the SDGs. So familiarizing yourself with those elements is really important. Next slide, please. And then also making sure that you're keeping up with this agenda. This isn't an agenda that's static. There is progress being made, there is progress being lost every year. So trying to keep up with that progress through the various publications highlighted here, the annual UN progress report, the annual World Bank SDG Atlas, and the final chart there is taken from the SDG Index and Dashboards by SDSN. And that also highlights the fact that this is a global agenda, but it's also a local agenda. So understanding what the SDGs mean in the geographies you operate is also an important part of understanding what the goals actually are. Next slide, please. And then when you come on to defining priorities, and this is a whole webinar in itself, but I'll just touch on these quickly. These two key concepts, which Caroline alluded to, this idea of principled prioritization. So really important to get this step right, because if you end up defining the wrong priorities, that can set you on the wrong path entirely when engaging with the goals. And important to take into consideration the risks to people and the environment that your business has and how that links to the SDGs, and then the potential opportunities that you can create through new product and services investments. So understanding both elements of that is key really to understanding your SDG interactions. Next slide, please. And then also taking a value chain approach when you do that analysis. So it's not just a case of looking at your own operations, it's a case of looking along the value chain and thinking, where can you increase your positive impacts and where can you minimize your negative impacts, and giving equal weighting to each of those dimensions. Next slide, please. When it comes to measurement and disclosure, this is possibly the trickiest part. So once you've identified the areas that you want to interact with, what should you then be setting in terms of targets? What should you be disclosing? And this is where the SDG Compass is very useful. It has on its online site, sdgcompass.org, there is an inventory of different business indicators. So you can filter through by SDG goal or by SDG target as well, and look for what pre-existing indicators and disclosure organs that are already there to enable you to track your progress and to report on the SDGs. There are some cases, obviously, where there aren't targets yet, but where there aren't indicators yet, but for the most part, there are pre-existing resources already there, or guidelines already there, which show you how to report on these various elements. Next slide, please. And just a couple of do's and don'ts when it comes to the final part of that process, the reporting side. Some things to avoid when reporting, some best practice when reporting. I think some of the the key things to avoid is a disconnect between your SDG messaging and your corporate strategy. Those really need to be aligned. The SDGs need to be part of the dialogues that are going on at CEO level, and the disclosures going on at CEO level, and being clearly there in your corporate strategy. SDG washing, I'm sure we've all heard of, or rainbow washing, we've also heard it called this week. So only talking about the positive impacts you have on the SDGs without taking that principal prioritization approach. Cherry picking is just using those SDGs or prioritizing those SDGs that fit very easily, and not digging deeper into the agenda to really understand where you interact with it. And then retrofitting, so having a sustainability strategy in place, but only linking that to the SDGs, not actually using the SDGs as a starting point to understand new opportunities to impact that you may have. And then on the flip side, best practice is really what we just talked about there as well. So clear and top level commitment to the SDGs, showing an understanding of that complexity of the business case, principal prioritization, and target level disclosure. I think that's really important as well, to really show you understood and analyze this agenda, to be able to report on how you interact with it at the target level rather than the goal level is really important. Next slide, please. And I'll just rocket through these very quickly just to show you some of the sort of trends we're seeing among WBCSD's membership. So we did a survey of our members in our global network. 78% of companies conducting prioritization of the SDGs at the moment. Some SDGs perhaps being left behind on that prioritization, particularly SDG 14 ranking very lowly, and some of the other social goals around inequality, poverty, and hunger not ranking particularly highly. Next slide, please. And again, this is highlighting perhaps a lack of interaction with the SDGs at the level of depth that is really required at the moment as companies sort of get to grips with this agenda. Only a third of companies taking action to identify negative impacts. Just over a third of companies analyzing the SDGs across the value chain, and just over a third of companies analyzing the SDGs at that crucial target level. So some work to be done in terms of the depth of detail people are going into in terms of organizing and analyzing the SDGs. Next slide, please. And then when it comes to targets as well, still something that a lot of companies are grappling with. 6% have set new targets related to the SDGs, 47% have identified existing sustainability targets that link to the SDGs, and 40% planning to do so in the future. So it's still, people are still coming to grips with this agenda, and still some scope for more detailed target setting moving forward. Next slide, please. And then these are the three key focus areas that people are looking to tackle. So further integrating the SDGs into corporate strategies and business planning, enhancing measurement and KPIs, and improving reporting against the SDGs, the three priority areas that companies that we've spoken to are really focusing on moving forward. And it's great to see that these are priority areas and lots of work to do in terms of enhancing that and supporting those efforts. Thank you, and I think that's it from me. Just one final slide to highlight. We have an online resource called the SDG Business Hub, where we collect a lot of the developments and the evolving landscape around business and the SDGs, so please do visit it for further information. And that's all from me.
James, thank you very much for your presentation. Now we will move on to Frank Henke, who is the Global Head of Environment and Sustainable Development from Adidas Group. Frank, the floor is yours.
Hello, Stephanie, dear all. Thanks a lot for that kind introduction, and I'm happy to contribute to that webinar this afternoon as a company representative. I would like to give you in the remaining minutes a top-line overview about how Adidas sustainability strategy is shaped and evolved, what the key influencers are, and how we as a company cope with global guidance frameworks and further directions. Stephanie was quite right in saying that when we kicked off our program a couple of years ago, that was quite long before the Sustainable Development Goals and other frameworks like the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines were available. But we had to address the topics which were most material to our business practices already 20 years ago. Through my continuous engagement I have with other company representatives, I quite often notice that many companies are struggling a little bit with the language as it used in the guidance materials. Some of them often say, well, they sound pretty academic and it's really hard to fully execute them and to bring them in the business practices. But I think the way how James has presented the core principles, the do's and don'ts, are an excellent tool for companies to look into and to follow that direction. Given the fact that we had to address sustainability topics in the absence of the sustainability goals some years ago, we quite strictly followed a kind of a continuous sustainability management process, saying that this is a constant learning, and there is, based on our experience, certainly no perfect system. But sustainability management allows you to engage with stakeholders upfront and to listen to their concerns and point of views, which basically is a very, very first step of a sustainability management process cycle, which ideally should start with an effective stakeholder engagement, helping you to identify the most material or most salient issues. Sometimes this is certainly not an easy process, and particularly if you take these issues quite honestly, even seeking indirect engagement with stakeholders, a company normally would not sit down and listen to critical voices. I mean, this is in particular also, and it's been a learning exercise for a company like Adidas, which kicked off the program 20 years ago, and had to go through that learning process in listening to critical stakeholder groups, which in the end are extremely valuable in the further shaping of a program. But where the challenge starts is how to cope with this feedback, how to keep with the expectations which you take from external sources, but well as through internal review processes, and then to translate this into effective targets and priorities, longer term goals, but also annual milestones in the best way, in a measurable way, which allows you to track progress and to report on achievements, but also on challenges. The devil lies in the detail if it comes to execution and to progress tracking, because here it's really critical to be in sync with the overall operating model we as a company applied to get the buy-in from the top management, but also in the same way very closely, or even saying seamlessly working with the middle management if it comes to execution. This is also a quite important lesson Adidas went through in how to seamlessly integrating sustainability targets and milestone with the overall business targets. External reporting is the important in that way, and not to be shy in sharing findings, observations, achievements, as well as results with the stakeholder community. Not just the great stuff you have achieved, because external reporting forms a very important part in seeking a direct engagement with the stakeholder community. But it also helps to drive and continued engagement and discussions within an organization. So external reporting has let's say, a twofold benefit. It's a good baseline for stakeholders to comment and to provide feedback, as well as to engage with various levels within the organization, which help you to shape the sustainability agenda further. This is basically, let's say, the last step before the findings as well as the feedback is going to be reviewed as part of the follow-up stakeholder engagement and the materiality assessment. Next slide, please. I would like to spend a few minutes or a few seconds on the topic of managing what matters, which is really about how to identify the most material, most salient topics for a company. And here we look at various levels, and of course the Sustainable Development Goals as well as other international frameworks are a great tool in identifying what are the so-called global megatrends and what are the conclusions drawn from the review of those megatrends. But at the same way, it's really important to look at the most important business industry trends in the branch of industry we as a company, as an organization are operating. And even more importantly, to directly engage with stakeholders who are directly impacted by our business operations. As some of you might know, we have a quite comprehensive social and environmental program rolled out in our global supply chain. We have experts in our key sourcing countries present who deal with the day-to-day operations with our business partners, our suppliers. They manage the connections and the engagements with local labor rights organizations, with environmental groups, with governments, with union federations. So their feedback is extremely important for the further shaping of the overall sustainability agenda. I wanted to highlight that the process of identifying materiality and the most salient points takes place on several levels, and the Sustainable Development Goals definitely are an excellent framework to look at what topics are to be addressed. But in the same way, it's really important to also understand what is going on industry level, but also then on the company level, which helps you to be much more precise in addressing the most salient points. Next slide, please. I would like to give you a general overview how we have translated all these findings, the results of our stakeholder engagement, but also following the direction as it is framed in the Sustainable Development Goals and other framework directions into our strategy. We had kicked off in late 2015, but we have taken one additional step, which was really critical for us. We have taken a very active outreach to our consumer community, because as a consumer-facing brand, it's extremely important to understand what consumers' expectations are, in particular those target audiences we want to achieve with our services and with our products. And based on these consumer analytics exercise, but also including the results of a materiality assessment, we ended up with a sustainability framework, which is basically covering our entire operating model, which can be relatively simply summarized with two stages: where sport is made, where sport is sold, and where sport is played. The made pillar basically covers all phases, covering the design of our products, the development, the material sourcing, and the manufacturing, more or less from the cotton field to the hanger. Sold covers all of our distribution operations, if it's to the consumer, if it's wholesale activities, retail activities, or e-commerce, and how we can influence the sustainability agenda through that pillar. And last but not least, where sports is played, is how can we use or can take leverage from our engagement with sports stars, with sports federations, and to bring the topic of sustainability closer to our consumers. Within these three pillars, we defined two areas, which is the so-called product dimension as well as the people dimensions. And within or for each of them, we defined so-called strategic priorities. For the product side, it's related to water, to materials, as well as to energy and carbon emissions. And on the people side, it's related to people empowerment, improvement of health, and inspire action. For each of these strategic priorities, we have formulated and developed quantifiable targets to be achieved by 2020. There's more detailed information available on our corporate website where we have explained our approach in more detail. But it was for us really important to put figures behind the strategic priorities, which allows us to measure and to track progress. It is not a simple exercise. It requires a lot of thinking about how to formulate specific targets as well as annual milestones. But it also requires us to be extremely focused on those priorities which we believe can manage in a certain period of time. And that's why we had defined the strategic scope or the strategic time period up to 2020. And from next year onwards, we are going to revise our strategy and looking what are the most critical priorities to be looked at until 2025. So this is my brief summary of the way how we dealing with sustainability development goals, how we translate this into our business targets as well as in our sustainability targets. And having said this, I would like to hand back to Stephanie. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. So I think it's time now for us to take a few questions. We have 6 minutes before the end of this webinar, so we received quite a few questions here. Some of them can be, let's say, summarized maybe in the one question around, I would say, the business case. So it's a kind of group question. I'm going to ask each of you to give your views on this. So basically, so our listeners say that we talk a lot about the importance of the SDGs in terms of global development, future generation, but we know also that companies need to be able to prove the business case. And yes, long-term profitability is important, but also on the short term. Do you have example from your practice on how the SDGs can impact really the bottom line for companies? I will maybe start with Frank, actually.
I mean, first of all, I mean, as I said, as a consumer-facing company, we are well aware about the value and the benefits of our corporate reputation. So that means risk and reputation management is a business case in itself, in particular for a company that is so much focusing on consumer-facing. When we have rolled out major part of our program, we of course have seen a lot of process improvements, which resulted, for example, in a higher transparency in our supply chain, which ended up in a stronger consolidation of our supply network. We have, when in particular looking at the rollout of our environmental program, specifically referring here to our energy and water targets and the deliveries we have achieved to date, we have seen quite significant savings in those areas. And in regards to the people side and the way to support our business partners, our suppliers, managing decent work in their factories, I mean, we have seen quite strong positive impacts in terms of seeing much less labor unrest or strikes, which of course positively contributes, I think, to on-time shipments of our products, which at the end also positively impacts our product being available on the shelf on time. So far from my side, Stephanie.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Caroline or James, do you want to react on that question?
Sure, a couple of quick thoughts, because I'll go back to the sort of the people part, the human rights lens that I was talking about. And I think, you know, of course, medium to long-term benefits will often accrue where short-term ones don't always. But I think what we see here is, you know, we know the balance between risk and opportunity. We know that they are flip sides of each other. And so where you reduce these sort of critical risks to people, you typically are reducing risks to the business as well, right? And we know in this age of transparency and high-speed communications that when those instances of forced labor or child labor, or the campaigns or studies around poverty wages or lack of building safety in supply chains hit the agenda, they hit it fast and they hit it furious, and there's big reputational damage that can be done. But also, if you're not a brand company, you know, more scrutiny from buyers, and so to that business opportunity, and Frank has referred to business continuity as well from a buyer perspective on the supply chain. But increasingly as well, we see companies measuring the difference that it makes for employee recruitment and retention, as well as productivity in many instances, where companies are able to demonstrate they're taking respect for people, respect for human rights seriously, and that's near term and long term.
Thank you, Caroline. James, a few thoughts about this question?
Yeah, just very quickly, I would take the investor and financial lens, I guess, and highlight how these considerations are increasingly on the agenda of investors and finances. I mentioned these ESG facilities that were put out this year. So one case in point, the company, Singapore agri company Olam, borrowed $500 million this year, which is directly linked to an ESG facility. So its score on various ESG rankings. So if it performs better in terms of its ESG performance, then it pays back less money. So that's as clear a business case as I can see. And equally on the investor side, investors increasingly looking at these sorts of metrics in their decision making. The benchmarking alliance initiative I highlighted has been led by UK pension fund Aviva. So they're seeing value in knowing who the better performers are to inform their investments. So clear financial implications emerging.
Thank you, James. Actually, I have another question for you, which one of our listeners asked: how to go about prioritizing SDGs when at the same time our business is constantly changing?
That's very good, and a very good point. And I don't think it's something you should do once. I think it's an iterative process, in the same way that you have a materiality process that you maybe revisit every couple of years. I think it's something that you need to keep progressing. As Caroline was alluding to, the risks that you have to people, they will change over time, depending on how you develop into different areas or different geographies, etc. And similarly, as the SDGs or progress towards the SDGs, we know more about how we're doing globally. Other opportunities will emerge, new technology will emerge, new opportunities come about. So I think it needs to be something that you continue to revisit on a regular basis.
I have another question for Frank, maybe. Frank, I have a question when it comes to the consumers. Do you think that the consumers are enough aware of the sustainable development goals? And do you think that it somehow influences their buying behaviors?
Honestly, Stephanie, I don't think that the average consumer is aware of the sustainability goals. I think it's much more important to drive their excitement and their engagement through very specific activities. I would like to give you an example. I mean, based on one of our recent initiatives, I mean, which is related with Parley for the Oceans program, where we not only have placed a product, but also we're seeking a direct engagement to consumers participating in that agenda and providing a contribution. For example, as it is a link to the Run for the Oceans. I mean, seeking new ways, attractive ways, very exciting ways to engage with consumers and making him part of the solution, and not seeing him as a passive recipient of services and goods. And I think this is an envisioned approach, I think, which needs to be further elaborated and further intensified.
Thank you, Frank. Maybe just a last one, because I'm aware that we are, I think, almost over this webinar. For Caroline, I mean, also linking to the consumers' awareness, do you think that somehow the governments could help businesses to and encourage them more to implement the sustainable development goals? And what else could they do to support businesses?
Yeah, I mean, governments are critical in creating an enabling environment for all kinds of responsible business conduct, and engaging also through their own activities as procurers in rewarding the right practices. So they have a critical role to play in this. And I think, you know, the challenge with consumers, I would very much support what Frank was saying. I think it's going to be slow for a lot of this to translate for consumers. I think there are real limits on it translating, because it's a huge agenda, and I think it is much more specific things that consumers will relate to and get active around. So you see, you know, around, for instance, in the UK, a Modern Slavery Act, the conversation growing around what this means and what this is, and how you see modern slavery not just overseas in supply chains, but in the United Kingdom as well, and getting the public aware of those issues. But critical to that then is also an education exercise. And I think government has a role to play there, because I think too often consumers, sometimes civil society organizations, can be slow to understand the complexity of the realities that companies are grappling with, and what it really takes to drive change, and the time it takes, and the collaboration it takes. So I think enabling a more nuanced conversation that enables companies that, of course, don't have it all solved, no company has, but are truly showing active participation and innovation to be part of the solution. The government role in enabling those conversations with the public to show and differentiate those companies that are an active part of solutions, that are working for progress, so that that can be recognized and rewarded increasingly by all kinds of actors, and ultimately, we hope, of course, consumers as well. But we need that education. These are tough issues. They wouldn't be in the Sustainable Development Goals if they weren't tough issues, and we need to understand just what it takes and be able to reward those who are driving change.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Caroline, James, and Frank, for a fascinating discussion. This webinar is coming to its end. Thank you also to all our listeners for joining this webinar. It will be available online on our website very soon. We are also going to try as much as possible to answer the remaining questions in writing format. As James said before, it is Global Goals Week this week, so we invite you also to become part of Amforis Interactive Mosaic that we have launched this week to also play our part and raise awareness and engagement around the SDGs. So if you want to join this campaign, well, just tweet a photo to @Amfori-INTL with the SDG that you find most relevant to your work. Use the hashtag Accelerate Together, and then you can look through the mosaic to see who supports the same SDGs as you. So thank you very much for your participation today. If you want to learn more about Amfori and also the work of our expert speakers and our work on SDGs, you can visit us at amfori.org and also follow us on Twitter. So see you soon.
Thank you for listening to this Amfori Unleash Opportunity webinar. To learn more about Amfori and our activities, visit us at www.amfori.org or find us on LinkedIn and Twitter.